Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm George Frampton, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on community scale implementation of green urban design. By the words urban and community scale, what we mean is how do cities actually go about planning and executing infrastructure investments that can help achieve climate ambition, not frustrate it. Well, first, a little housekeeping. This event is on the record. We're live streaming to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about today's discussion, share it on social media using the hashtag AC Energy for Atlantic Council Energy, and tagging us at AC Global Energy for the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. Those of you who are watching on Zoom can submit questions in the Q&A portal at the bottom of your Zoom screen anytime during the event, and we'll try to get to those as many as we can. So a central goal of the Biden administration's $2 trillion infrastructure plan is to update and improve the nation's infrastructure in a climate-friendly way. But in the past, I think it's fair to say that infrastructure spending has often been pretty climate unfriendly. Many of the retrofits and upgrades called for in the Biden plan are going to take place at the local level in American cities, deploying green urban design practices, such as those included within the smart surfaces framework, which we're going to discuss, that's being advocated by a broad coalition of cities and urban planners, is one way to do this. We're hoping today's conversation can provide a little bit of insight into how cleaner urban infrastructure can deliver climate, economic, and environmental justice benefits. And we're delighted to host this conversation with three esteemed panelists who bring a variety of perspectives from their work in sustainability, in energy, and in climate justice. First, Greg Katz is a national expert in green building standards, helped draft LEED standards, was a managing partner in Good Energies, the first global private equity venture fund in the clean energy space. He is the founder and CEO of Smart Surfaces Coalition, author of the book Greening Our Built World, Costs, Benefits, and Strategies, and president of Capital E. Jennifer Roberts, director of the Path to Positive Communities program at Eco America, is a former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, and has grappled with these issues very directly and with quite a bit of passion. And she's in a position to talk about how it actually works at the city level. And Sarili Patel is director of the Center for Climate, Health, and Equity at the American Public Health Association. So thank you to all three of you. We're really pleased to have you with us today. Greg, starting with you, what kinds of urban infrastructure investments really actually qualify as green and promote climate ambition? And what does it mean for a city to have smart surfaces, and why is that important?
Thank you, George, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting us. And I'm excited and honored to be on this panel with such two distinguished colleagues and friends. If you think about when we went out into space, everyone thought, gosh, we're exploring the moon. We really look back and we saw this beautiful little marble and realized we're alone on this planet. And people now increasingly think about cities as they do from the drone's perspective, looking down. Those surfaces are how we manage sun and rain. It turns out we've done a terrible job to design surfaces to do those things, manage sun and rain. We put in dark and impervious surfaces. They make our cities 9 to 10 degrees hotter in the summer. Low-income areas maybe 15 degrees hotter because they're impervious. Water runs off. You get a lot of pollution. You get contamination. And it makes much of urban America in the summer inhospitable to life generally. We hide behind air conditioning. And so smart surface is really saying, look, the selection that we make of our surfaces, is it a green surface or is it a dark surface? Does it reflect the sunlight back into space, cooling the city and the earth, or does it absorb all that heat and re-radiate it and then bakes us through the long summer nights? Those design choices have not been conscious choices to date. And the purpose of the coalition is to assemble the leading organizations in their field: the American Public Health Association, American Institute of Architects, National League of Cities, Habitat for Humanity, American Planning Association, 45 cities, to say, look, we can do better. And the theme of the infrastructure bill that you talked about, George, which is Build Back Better, is exactly about this. So why would you design a surface that is inhospitable, that makes cities hotter, more polluted, less equal, less competitive, when instead, at roughly the same price, you can design in surfaces that are green, porous, reflective, and includes trees and solar. And so in the work that we've done with a bunch of cities, Baltimore, for example, we're completing a project with Baltimore, shifting the surface selection in Baltimore over the next 10 years creates a net present value of $5 billion, and has a benefit cost ratio of over 4 to 1. And it cools the city, makes it more competitive, makes it less polluted, and impacts health. And obviously, the American Public Health Association has provided a clarion call about the importance of addressing urban structural environmental injustice. And Smart Surface is really designed to do that, to give the tools, including an online cost benefit analytic capability, to cities to run the scenarios, to say, gosh, what kind of city do we want? Do we want to become hotter during climate change, or do we want to become cooler? Do we want to become more equitable or less equitable? Do we want to create risks to our credit rating? We've analyzed this with Standard & Poor and Moody's. Adoption of smart services actually improves your credit rating as a city, protecting your access to low cost capital. So Smart Surface Coalition is a new organization, a 501c3. We're excited about the partnerships we're in. We're very excited about being able to make a contribution to make the United States, and cities in particular, more just, more healthy, reduce climate change impact, save jobs, and make us as a nation more competitive.
Greg, thank you. Um, I want to turn to Jennifer. As the former mayor of Charlotte, you've had a lot of personal experience at the city level in implementing these kinds of concepts and in seeing how the investments actually get made and what the impact is. So, what are the opportunities and challenges at the city level? And how do cities interrelate? You talked in the past about the city's relationship with the state and federal governments. When there's a major infrastructure funding from the federal government, do the cities and the states and the feds cooperate, or do they struggle with each other for to actually get it done?
Well, George, I think you asked me about four different questions there. But I want to echo Greg's comments and say thank you so much for having this conversation today. I thank the Atlantic Council, its partners, and supporters. These kind of conversations are critical because one of the things I learned as mayor and one of the things I work on now at Eco America is public engagement and how important it is for the public to understand the challenges cities are facing as we see our planet warming, as we see extreme weather increasing. And climate change is called a threat multiplier, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And so we do have a challenge with urban heat islands in our cities. I can tell you the conversation right now in America's cities are focused on a number of things. We're seeing sustainability crop up a lot more in planners and what they're talking about in codes that they're putting forward for the buildings in their cities, and equity. Equity is a very important conversation. We saw, of course, through the protests this summer, but we're also seeing it in the environmental space that people are realizing communities of color have not been in the conversation. And so when you look at urban heat islands that Greg mentioned, areas of the city that were formerly redlined, and this redlining happened in cities across our country, those areas can be 10 to 15 degrees hotter than other parts of the same city. Not to mention how much hotter they are than the rural areas around that have much more green space and more absorption and different surfaces that aren't black asphalt that are reflecting and that are absorbing and making those heat islands. We also know in hotter areas that there are more incidents of aggression and violence. We know that children don't learn as well. I mean, any parent will tell you their child gets fidgety when it's hot, but we have documented research that shows that learning goes down and test scores go down. We also know that in our public schools, 40% of them don't have air conditioning. And, these are just some of the things that cities are thinking about. They want to raise public awareness. We know through recent surveys that about 60% of white folks don't know about environmental justice and climate justice. They're not aware of these differences in their cities. We also know that the other question you asked about different layers of government. So not only do we have a lot of cities that are preempted in local action by their state governments, and we're seeing this in voting rights right now, but it also happens with any kind of infrastructure restrictions, clean water restrictions, a lot of things that states can preempt cities on. But we also, at the local level, have different entities. So we have cities and counties. Counties are often the health and human services aspect. So when you're looking at public health issues, which we'll hear about in a minute, you've got counties talking about that, but cities setting the rules for infrastructure. So again, there's that challenge of integration. Then, of course, we have the federal government, which we're, at cities are looking to because they have the real power to fund things like transit lines. Our next transit line could cost as much as $9 billion. And you are not going to be able to do that without federal support. And the other thing you're always looking to do is have private sector collaboration. And, these are all conversations that have to happen, but cities are only about 5 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. So you're always talking, private sectors have a lot of services as well, a lot of private parking lots and parking decks. That public awareness and engagement has to happen every step of the way. And we have to get better at including communities of color early in that conversation. So I'll stop there. I could say a lot more, but I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Thank you. So really, how does urban green design directly relate to health and equity outcomes? And how do we go about tying those together and make sure that they do?
Well, thanks for the question. I also want to extend my gratitude to the Atlantic Council for hosting the conversation today, a very important one and certainly a timely one. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the Piscataway Conoy, the people of the land that I'm sitting in and speaking from today. And although I don't hold or identify myself as Piscataway, I want to acknowledge the land to express my gratitude and appreciation and to encourage you to learn more about the history of this land and the land before. To answer your question, many US cities, the hottest areas, they tend to be also the poorest. And they're characterized by less greenery and darker surfaces, as Greg and Jennifer pointed out, resulting in higher temperatures around the year, but also especially during the summertime. And I think Jennifer was referring to a study that the University of Maryland and Portland State University did that showed that low wealth communities or areas can be 10 to 15 degrees hotter than high wealth areas. And this is Fahrenheit, not Celsius, not like the 2 degrees that we're talking about in the grand scheme of the global warming phenomenon. And it's not just about heat, right? The urban heat island effect also increases smog and respiratory illnesses among the most vulnerable or climate sensitive, I like to call them, like children, but also older adults, and in communities of low wealth and communities of color. And we know race, even more than class, is the #1 indicator for the placement of toxic facilities in the US. So to mix this topic of smart surfaces with the current pandemic, it's important to acknowledge the link between poor air and the risk of COVID-19. A Harvard study linked PM 2.5 to higher COVID deaths among people living in areas with higher rates of air pollution. And PM 2.5 further worsens the conditions of those who are having symptoms or even experiencing existing chronic illnesses like respiratory or cardiovascular disease, making them even more vulnerable to infectious diseases like COVID-19. So our problem It doesn't exist in the singular. The changing climate continues to pile onto our already devastating difficulties, like the economic crisis and the movement for racial equity. So communities that lack access and opportunity to those social goods that drive health, like access to healthcare, opportunity to earn a livable wage, affordability to live in a safe and healthy home. These burdens, when layered with phenomenon like COVID-19 and climate change, widens the health gap across the country. And overall, a less healthy physical environment in low wealth areas can be lined to increase healthcare costs, increase sick days, and add on to energy bills. And we know that zip codes determine health outcomes for a community more than individuals' genetic code. And so health is influenced by a broad range of factors, including access to an outdoor environment and community safety, which is why we can't solve these challenges with a visit to the doctor's office or a prescription. It's the 80% of a person's ability to achieve good health comes from these non-clinical determinants of health, like education, housing, safety, food, and so much more. So from where I sit, it's hard to overstate these interconnections between climate change, health, and equity. And at APHA, the American Public Health Association, we define inequity as barriers that prevent individuals and communities from accessing these conditions from reaching their full, these communities from reaching their full potential. And many of these health and quality of life measures can be improved through urban adoption of smart surfaces. By decreasing urban heat and flooding while improving air quality, it's huge, and it'll have the largest benefits across and not just the low wealth neighborhoods, but across the entire city, making a city more equitable and livable. Not to mention improving social cohesion and building avenues to psychosocial resilience. We're expecting these area-specific climate events to impact our health physically, but also emotionally. And climate change will accelerate the demand for mental health services. Yet the needs for communities of colors today are unmet by the healthcare system due to stigma or discrimination, inadequate insurance coverage, and even lack of trained professionals in the area. So while we need to drive investments in our mental health system to build psychosocial resilience, it's also important to do these physical changes, have these physical changes to our neighborhoods that drive positive changes for mental health. All in all, the solutions to address the climate crisis, along with the other co-occurring crises, does not rest with one sector or agency. We need a thoughtful partnership among community voices as well as agencies to guide creative reinvestment of policy and resources so that we can build an economy that values human well-being over profits. And applying smart surfaces is a terrific tool to build communities back stronger so they are resilient to the continuous climate impacts on our health.
Thank you. That's very important. I guess I have two questions for Jennifer and Cirilli, but and either of you, probably either one, but one more for Jennifer, one more for Cirilli. And the first question is, President Biden's campaign promise and the promise carried out in the proposal for his infrastructure plan is that 40% of the investment be devoted to having an impact on frontline communities, disadvantaged communities, areas of pollution, people of color in urban areas. And I guess my two questions are, one, from the city's point of view, city government point of view, do we have metrics or strategies for figuring out how to do that and how to hold people accountable for the way in which the investment was deployed? And the second related question is, how do you, as a planner or a city official or an advocate, make sure that the environmental justice community is included in that process? So it's a position to argue for the 40% that's been promised. So maybe I can ask Jennifer to go first and then Cirilli, either question or both.
Sure. So, the question about, do cities have the capability to measure, to look at, to hold accountable? It's amazing what has happened with GIS mapping. And it is amazing the technology and the data sets that we have now. Again, large cities are going to have more resources than small and even mid-sized cities, but a lot of those mid-sized cities are working with organizations like the Urban Sustainability Directors Network or National League of Cities, who are also part of our Smart Services Coalition, and they're getting that technical expertise. And so we do have the availability of data that shows like those temperature differentials. We know which surfaces are reflecting. We know where the dark surfaces are. We've actually done a lot around pervious and impervious surfaces because flooding is becoming a bigger concern. And so a lot of cities have reworked the way that they require developers to put, grass islands in the middle of parking lots and have certain impervious surfaces that are reflective. The challenge again is integrating the work and recognizing that it has to be a public-private partnership. And we know that we need the private sector to understand it as well. It needs to be part of that climate risk assessment. And so we want to absolutely apply the local and federal dollars to make sure that our public spaces and our public infrastructure is doing the right thing. But we want to make sure we're engaging people as well, and that we're spreading that message and communicating with the public, because people like Cirilli and our healthcare community are incredibly strong voices. They're trusted messengers. That's what we call them at Eco America. They're trusted messengers about the health impacts, which everybody should care about, especially in this time of COVID. We know that we're only as strong as our weakest areas of our city, and that equity is such a loud and important voice right now. So that 40%, we actually, in Charlotte, not only do we know where those hotter neighborhoods are, we know where the food deserts are. And so some of these communities that could really benefit by having some of these small community gardens, some of that greening that helps with that hot surface, turn parking lots into community gardens. There's so many things you can put gardens on. Affordable housing, you can have vines, and you can have those small plots. There's so many things that can be done. And it is really about engaging people. It is about letting those communities have a voice on how they want their communities to look, to be healthy, to be inclusive, to be part of that infrastructure spending. We look very carefully at that in Charlotte, and most cities do. They want to make sure, and when you have representative government, each city council person knows where the funds are going in their district. And so they want to make sure that they're getting that equitable distribution. And that goes for our state legislatures as well, that we know, how those dollars are being distributed. But we look forward to working with the Biden administration, with this coalition, with other strong voices about how we ensure that those voices are helping to direct that spending and building community, that social cohesion that's really talked about. These kinds of, parks and the community gardens, but also the cooler spaces outside that kids can play in instead of those hot asphalt surfaces. All of these are ways that cities can move forward. We need the political will, and we need the inclusive voices to do it.
Cirilli?
Yeah, what a fantastic answer. I would just add that a tool in your toolbox for cities, city officials, are the health departments. The state and local health departments are working extremely hard to identify climate sensitive communities, are trying to work with CDC's BRACE program, which is the Building Resilience Against Climate Effects. And they have a great framework to help state and local and tribal health departments figure out where communities need the most help and meet them where they are. And I guess when we're talking about building stronger communities and building community power, we're talking about looking at households, businesses, students, and other ways for self-determination. And we want to make sure that resources, whether from subsidies, assistance programs, funding infrastructure, the ability to vote, can all offer communities a way to govern themselves and speak up for themselves and play an active role in the geopolitical and decision-making of their own community. So when we're talking about lifting up communities and public health, we're also often talking about the 3 principles of health equity, which are procedural equity, distributive equity, and contextual. And really quickly, without giving you a lecture on equity, I will say that procedural equity encompasses the fairness in the political process and participation in decision making. Invite community members to sit at the decision-making table, have them tell us where they want that tree canopy, where they're seeing flooding, why they can't access their bus route because the bus is moving too quickly through their neighborhood because it's not dangerous, it's not too safe, or there's too much flooding or what have you. Let's talk about distributive equity quickly. That really talks about highlighting the need to consider not just the allocation of benefits, but also the burden. So what's happening when we make these infrastructure decisions and changes, and how are we doing it? Are we blocking off an entire segment of public transit because we're building extra infrastructure to benefit the community or benefit a community? What does that mean? How do people access their jobs or their doctors, et cetera? So let's talk about not just the benefits, but the burden. And then contextual equity really just recognizes that the playing field is never leveled, but that people's ability to access resources and power determine their ability to engage in the process, whether it's political or decision making, and so that they can all speak for themselves to determine the best distributive outcome. So as you can imagine, these actions don't require financial support. They do, but they don't. But they also require leveraging and partnership. And sometimes financial support is necessary to get community voices to the table because they're competing jobs and other priorities. But certainly having the invitation and then making that invitation accessible is a key takeaway I want to leave you with.
Thank you very much. Greg, let me ask you, there's a question from the audience about surfaces and whether there are particular technologies that are there or under development that are important to the Clean Surfaces program. But also in connection with that, I want to ask you, how does the mechanism work to encourage or even force cities to use these programs? In other words, is it a matter of trying to write something into legislation about the way the money is used, or is this really about promulgating best practices that states commit to get cities to use? What are the technologies, and how do you make sure that they get used in the process of federal funding of, let's say, 90% state funding and 10% of the actual construction that's done?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. So the way cities make decisions now is you talk to a CFO of a city council member, and they're like, oh yeah, surfaces, go talk to the Department of Transportation. So you go talk to the head of the Department of Transportation. This is true of every city, by the way. And then you say, well, do you ever think about impact on heat? No. Do you ever think about, when you choose a surface, impact on air pollution or water pollution? No. Do you ever think about equity or any of the health and equity things that Shirley and Jennifer are talking about? No. Do you think about impact on credit rating, livability, city competitiveness, jobs? No, 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 no. It's all first cost. So the tool set has to be, how do you think about surfaces generally? How do you make a decision differently? And to do that, a city needs to be able to think through the choices it has and what the implications are. So what we're finding is with the cities that we work with, once they say, okay, this is really helpful because we had sort of allocated a decision to specifying a surface to the Department of Transportation. Now we're taking that back. We're saying, wait a minute, we don't like being 9 degrees hotter. We don't like low income neighborhoods that are 15 to 20 degrees hotter. We don't like tourism dropping off in the summer because people are worried about excess heat. We don't like the economic risk to our city because of climate change. So now we understand that the surfaces we specify allow us to mitigate that risk. So in the case of the Biden infrastructure bill, you have $2 trillion, 40% of that should go to low income. That's where you want it to go. Why do you want it to go there? Because those low income areas are hotter, they're impervious, they've got few trees. So what happens when you invest in those communities and you say the infrastructure money that goes in for new roads, new surfaces, new schools, new bridges. Instead of doing the lowest cost, which is dark and impervious, you could call them stupid surfaces, right? Instead, you specify reflective surfaces, porous surfaces, green surfaces. What happens? Well, a couple things happen. First is the city gets less hot. So neighborhoods can cool by 3 or 4 degrees in the space of a couple of years through adoption of surfaces. The second thing that happens is you don't get all this water runoff, which means you don't get the ice buildup, you don't have pollution running off, you don't have mold buildup, which is a huge driver of asthma and allergy. 1 out of 10 kids has allergies. One of my 3 kids has allergies. So the environment that you live in determines whether you can get to school on time or whether you're stuck at home because of allergic problems. That should not be an outcome of the zip code you're born in. It should be the case that every city child, every child in a town lives in an environment that's conducive to their health and their learning. And so what's exciting about this infrastructure bill is it gives the cities for the first time the opportunity, working with the Smart Surfaces Coalition and other organizations, to make a conscious decision about their surfaces instead of stupid surfaces, dark and impervious, that make us sick and hot and increase our electricity bills. We're going to choose surfaces that bounce heat back into space because we don't want that heat in the summer. We're going to choose surfaces that allow the water to go into the ground and recharge groundwater because we don't want water runoff and mold. We don't want ice building up on the surface in the winter, which cause people to fall and slip. We want green surfaces so that the air is clean. We want trees so that people get shaded and they can be outside in a vibrant environment. And so Build Back Better is really starts with saying we have a choice. We can do the old, dumb, stupid, dark, impervious, or we could do green, reflective, pervious surfaces. And the tool set that we've developed, the cost analytics on the website, so smartsurfaces.com, would allow any city to make a much smarter choice. In fact, many cities are already beginning to do this. They're starting to invest in more trees or putting in solar, but you want to, like a good painter, have more than one color. You don't want to just paint a scene with red. You want a bunch of different surface options. You choose the set that works best for you. And again, the net present value for average mid-sized city adoption is on the order of billions of dollars. Payback is around 4 to 1. So it's a very compelling cost benefit strategy that any CFO should be thrilled by, and anybody who cares about city competitiveness or the health of our children is going to insist on.
So Greg, let me ask all 3 of you, you've talked about smart versus stupid services. What are the other, question from the audience, what are other, 2 or 3 other leading asks? What are the things that, are most important to try to get into urban infrastructure investment programs now that are different from what's been done up to date in addition to smart surfaces?
Well,
Tammy?
I'm gonna start with a more political answer and a less technical answer.
Good.
Because one of the things that cities and counties, and I've been on the governing committee for the National League of Cities and the National Association of Counties, because I've also been a county commissioner. And one of the things that we recognize is that our country is a very diverse country, demographically, but also geography and climate impacts differ from city to city, even within the same state. So what we always emphasize when we're dealing with our federal partners is let local communities make the decisions. And so one of the proposals that was put forward in looking at how does infrastructure spending get to the local level, we've used in the past what are called community development block grants, CDBG for those who know the acronyms and the lingo. But those have been very effective in things like supporting affordable housing, supporting community projects, clean water infrastructure, greenway expansion. We use CDBG grants for a lot of these things, but the key is to let local governments who are closer to the population, who are closer to the challenges, who know about where, the food deserts are and where the hot neighborhoods are, is to let them make those decisions. So I would counsel our federal partners not to be too prescriptive, but to have block grants that can be used at the local level for those kind of infrastructure changes. And you can start in a community with some of the easier surfaces, some of the green areas, some of the things that can be implemented, not just for the public sector, but also in the private sector, and start to grow that. It's going to take some time, but I would really emphasize that local voice, and in line with what Cerulli was talking about, make sure that low-income neighborhoods as well as the wealthier neighborhoods are included in making those decisions. And if you have a representative city council, this is why public engagement is so important. Those neighborhoods and those citizens need to be pushing their council member to support their voice in those decisions as well. And in that way, what Los Angeles does, or Atlanta, or New York, or Chicago, those are going to be different decisions, but they're going to fit what the impacts and the challenges and needs are of that local area.
Great, thank you. Cerulli, thoughts?
Yeah, that was a great response. I think I would just add to it by talking a little bit about transportation. Oftentimes when we're talking about smart surfaces, we're talking about greener ways, but one of the things that can contribute to the, reducing carbon emissions through transportation is creating an emphasis on active transportation. We're shifting from driving to more active modes of traveling, like walking, biking, rolling, just public transport in general, to reduce rates of non-communicable diseases also, like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, osteoporosis even. And to do this, making transportation carbon reduction central to the mission of transportation agencies and aligned with transportation expenditures with the goal of reducing climate pollution and vehicle miles traveled, supporting healthier communities and all. And invest in affordable housing to avoid displaced and very long distance commutes for families so that they can afford housing that's closer to their jobs. And, one of the things that worries me, if I were to worry about having smart surfaces take off, is gentrification. Whenever we beautify an area, we do tend to push out those who can't afford it. And so how do we do this in a way that aims to connect more than to disadvantage and push out others? So those are all different ways, and transportation is kind of at the heart of that.
Let me follow up on that for a moment. But Greg, first, thoughts that you have about that, and then I'll come back to the transportation issue.
Yeah, I mean, we've been able to put trees in wealthy neighborhoods, and it's where solar goes in. We've had solar on our home for 8 or 9 years. I'm not sure what gentrification means in this context. This is about allowing communities to be healthier, to reduce their energy bills, as Cerulli so well put it, allow people to be outside, which means they can walk and sustain a sense of community, which means they've got multiple choices in terms of transportation. All of that makes a community healthier and fair and more vibrant. And you think about kids running around outside, every child should be able to see birds nesting and hear bird calls. How do you put a dollar value on that? It's very hard, but we know in our hearts as parents that matters. And every child should have that experience. Some of the low-income communities that we're working with have 5% tree cover, which means kids are not in shade. They don't see birds. They don't play on grass. And that's wrong. And what I think is very powerful when you look at smart surfaces through a city lens is that correcting that long-term structural injustice, making low-income neighborhoods greener and more porous, dropping temperature by 10 degrees in the summer so you don't have excess heat deaths, which is a huge problem today. That from a city perspective, there are very large savings associated with that: lower energy bills, lower water treatment costs, lower health costs. And those benefits add up to be much larger than the cost of putting in the infrastructure. So what's exciting about the Build Back Better strategy, which is such a great name, because it recognizes that we often build back worse. We kind of heedlessly put in infrastructure and say, oh gosh, if only we hadn't caused a lot more flooding, if only we hadn't made that neighborhood much hotter. And so the Build Back Better, the target of 40% that you talked about earlier, George, we need to focus investments in lower income areas. Those benefits accrue citywide because temperature reduction, air pollution reduction, water pollution reduction in one neighborhood is shared citywide. So this is about making all of our lives better, but in particularly in redressing structural inequality reinforced by redlining in the last century, and redressing finally this institutionalized inequality in urban infrastructure. What's great again is we can do that, save money, and the Biden bill, if you add language directing money to do smart surfaces, not dark impervious surfaces, we can make a huge stride toward making our country fairer, more competitive, and healthier.
Well, thank you. Talking about uh, less well-off neighborhoods gives me a link to come back and ask questions about transportation that's really raised. It's not, in the Biden bill, a lot of attention has been paid to electrifying cars, 500,000 charging stations, money to encourage uh, purchase as well as manufacture of electric cars. But what hasn't gotten that much attention is the part of it that's designed to produce about 50,000 electric transit buses before the end of the decade, which would, and you could, given the average lifetime of current transit buses, replace about 70 to 80% of all transit buses today with electric buses. Now, and of course, the federal government finances 80 or 90% of most local transit buses and some of the infrastructure, charging infrastructure. So, my question really is here is an opportunity to encourage cities to really increase public transportation to disadvantaged neighborhoods where it's most needed, with clean buses where the air quality improvement is most needed. But that means also changing the cityscape. So if there's going to be a push to provide more public transportation to people who need it the most, that's changing a little bit the nature of the city as well as just producing vehicles. And how do cities, how likely is it that cities want to do this? In Europe, of course, over the last few years, there's been a huge amount of talk about the new mobility, bicycles, walking, and we know that from people who have green building investment funds that the greenest thing about a building is if it's near public transportation, because the emissions from the building are mostly the emissions of people getting to the building and getting home. How do cities and counties approach these issues of really trying to improve public transportation as an element of green cityscapes?
Well, again, you asked about 5 questions there.
I know.
So I'll say a few things about public transportation. Charlotte actually has been fortunate to be a non-traditionally transit-oriented city to one that is now building transit lines. We're about to finish our streetcar line. We've got about 20 miles of a light rail, and we were looking at the next phase. But one of the things we've noticed is that we're putting in a bike trail along the rail path. And that has become a great place for people to walk and bike safely. So you can do active transportation in connection with public transportation. And you are trying to get those emissions down as well. But when you think about, again, back to cooler cities, do you have shelters where people are standing in the heat, right? Do you have shelters that maybe reflect the artwork from some local artists honoring that neighborhood? And then you build that sense of place. We call it some placemaking that you want to have so people feel proud of their neighborhood and feel like they've been included in that conversation about transit. And when it comes to electric buses, absolutely. I think we have over 1,000 school buses that are taking kids. They're diesel buses driving through our neighborhoods with kids breathing diesel fumes. We should have parents across America saying, replace our school buses with electric buses, because we know that bus schedules are more flexible. Fixed rail is where it is, but when you've got neighborhoods that are changing and growing, You've got to have some buses as well, but absolutely support going electric in those buses. One of the things that we found at our airport, by the way, airports are other places where you can have a lot of smart surfaces. They have huge areas of asphalt and other things that are not just where the planes land. Big roofs, lots of opportunities there. Most of those are publicly operated. But we know our transit buses at the airport, we're replacing 70 diesel buses with 50 electric ones because they don't break down as much. And so there are all kinds of savings. I also want to talk for a minute about job creation. You think about the people who are going to be replacing roofs when we're going to put those cool roofs on, those reflective roofs. We're going to have a lot more people to be trained, maybe people who live in those neighborhoods to help with those green retrofits and upfits and help with, we actually have in some of our cities, they're painting some streets white or lighter in some of our challenged neighborhoods where the traffic is not as fast. They've tested the surface to make sure it's not slick. But again, those neighborhoods are going to see reduction in temperature. And again, we're creating jobs. That's the other thing I like about the Biden plan. It's a job creator when we talk about building back better. And that has to be inclusive as well.
Really,
Yeah, I'd like to add, I mean, I think I can't remember who hit on it. It was a beautiful point where it can't just be one solution, right? There's multi-solving that we need to have here. And so when we're talking about transportation, it'd be excellent to have more electric vehicles and more of those charging stations, shuttling more people around and making places more accessible. I think, when we do that, we also have to recognize that safety is an issue. So when we're bringing and I think Jennifer mentioned the correlation between low income and safety, low wealth communities, and making things as simple as putting a street light up, making sure there's street lights so that those paths are safe to walk on, or making sure that there's like an on-ramp and off-ramp for those who are rolling in their wheelchairs. It's also important to make sure that the stops that are put into place aren't in flooded areas. So that's where the smart surfaces plays hand-in-hand role. So it's not just one thing, it's many. And then if you're taking it to the next level, let's work on ways we can incentivize businesses and local businesses, as well as bigger ones like hospital systems, to incentivize active transportation. They have the power to do that, especially these bigger groups, where they can incentivize their employees, promote active transportation, give them some kind of incentive to bike, walk, roll in, take a active transportation or take public transit rather than bringing their own car, or figure out a way you can do a carbon offset. But certainly there are ways that we need to work within the community that we're talking about, and no two communities are the same, is what I say often, and figure out what their greatest challenges and needs are, and find solutions that are multi-solving, and also have different sectors kind of weighing in, because I think those are the strongest and most resilient in terms of solutions that can be carried forth.
I would just add on the jobs piece, the analysis that's been done by, we're starting to work with some multilateral development banks and some banks. One of our partners is a big bank. The jobs intensity of smart surfaces, which is resurfacing roads, it's trees, its green surfaces and the like, is very high. And so you create a lot of quality jobs very quickly. So that's a big objective of this administration. The second big objective is climate. So there's a very large climate impact from these strategies. And the third is environmental justice, as we talked about. It's a way to redress 2-century-old standing urban injustice, which makes the lives of kids who happen to be less well off or minority really crimped compared to wealthier neighborhoods. So it kind of hits these 3 points. And I think the jobs piece underlines something that we're all saying, which is adopting smart surfaces and these green strategies is not something that hurts the economy. What's very clear is it helps the economy. It makes our nation stronger. It reduces our energy bills. It makes people more competitive. It reduces health burdens. It allows kids to score better on standardized test scores. So it's a strategy that has very large financial benefits and very large risk reduction benefits. And that's kind of the beauty of the opportunity that lies before us.
Greg, let me ask you a sort of in from the side question. You've been involved in clean tech private equity investment, venture investment for quite a long time. Is the challenge of urban green investment, is that an area where technology development is really going to be important, as it certainly is in a lot of other areas in climate, whether it's battery cost or industrial decarbonization? Or is this really a matter of political will, planning, and funding of existing technologies? Is the technology pretty well known in there, or is it important that they're going to have to be technology development to do more for cities? I'll start with you, but I want to ask all three panelists that question.
Yeah, there's something called the U.S. Cool Roof Rating Council, which had joined actually as a partner last month, and they list thousands of surfaces and paints and roofing tiles, and they rate them based on their reflectivity. So the opportunity set today is very large to adopt smart surfaces. But as an investment area, it's also a really exciting area. We have a project we're starting with the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, which quantifies the additional benefits that people don't know about from putting solar into urban areas, including into low income. When you put solar on a roof, you're keeping the sunlight off, so you don't have as much heat gain in the building, which means you're reducing your air conditioning load. You're reflecting more light back, which reduces ambient temperature. The operations or efficiency of solar panels actually drops as the temperature rises. So by making these panels, putting them on top of reflective surfaces or green surfaces means your power generation actually goes output. And we're starting to see technology innovation around panels designed to bounce much more heat back into space, integrating green roofs, which are basically trays of green, with solar, so that those become part of the solar system. So that integrated technology manages sun, it manages rain. You have reduced installation and operation costs. It becomes that much more cost effective. So as a venture capital investor, this is a very big area for improving what is already a really compelling cost value investment proposition for cities in shifting from dark impervious to smart surfaces. We're going to see a lot of innovation in this space. People will become wealthy. The good thing is we'll become more competitive and healthier as a result of that competition and those investments.
Thanks. I have an interesting question from the audience, going back to Cirili's comment about gentrification. And maybe I can come back to you and also to Jennifer. I mean, the challenge of improving the livability and the efficiency and the healthiness of parts of our cities, when what may happen is lower income people just get forced out and to move someplace else. I mean, Cirili, is that the gentrification issue? Could you talk a little bit more about that, whether that's an issue and how one tries to protect against the potential problem that I just mentioned?
Sure. And I don't know if this is going to be an actual issue. This is something that those of us in the Smart Growth Network often talk about, is when we do develop in underdeveloped areas, what ramifications does it have? I mean, obviously the health benefits, the economic benefits. I talk about communities as low wealth or high wealth. I don't really talk about income, because income is specific to that household. When I'm talking about wealth of a community, I'm talking about the ability for them to have these green surfaces, have the transportation infrastructure, whether it's active or passenger based. I'm talking about wealth in the schools and the education process, because that also ties into climate, if you will. Cooling centers, churches, schools, they're all interrelated. So when a community is divested from, they also lose tax-paying dollars that go towards infrastructure, schools, housing, utilities, and so much more. And so when we are bringing back these types of non-clinical determinants of health, this is what we're seeing. We're seeing the property values going up. We're seeing more people wanting to have access to these investments. And what does that mean for the communities that are already there, the families that are already there? I don't think this has to be an inevitable end game where we, improve a community and then all of a sudden it's not affordable. I think it's also one of those partnerships that we mindfully have with local businesses. We have, that their rental properties won't go up. We have to have mindful conversations with housing and property investors, and so that those values don't go up over time, and that we need cooler spaces. I think Greg does a great job convincing anybody he talks to why we need these types of tools put into place, especially in those darker communities, which also happen to be those low wealth communities. But gentrification is something is a term that I hate to use, but as also something that we're always thinking about, because we don't want these unintended consequences to happen when we are trying to build back better.
Jennifer, we just have a minute or two, I guess, 3 minutes, but thoughts about that?
So, people talk about eco-gentrification. And it is true that, when New York did the High Line, when Atlanta's doing the Green Belt, when you do these massive big projects in formerly low-income areas, yes, people get displaced. And so one of the solutions to that is these small pocket parks and, planting trees, not changing the infrastructure in a huge way, buying people out and putting in a huge greenway or a huge park, but doing these small projects where every neighborhood can have access, and looking at greener spaces, sidewalks, light colored sidewalks. Many of our low income communities don't have sidewalks and aren't safe because people are walking literally in the street. And so there are a lot of things that don't necessarily raise the cost of living for the folks in these areas, but do improve their health outcomes, improve their access to services, and lower the temperatures. And so we do have to be conscious about eco-gentrification, but there are ways, there are solutions. A lot of people have written about this. The U.S. Green Building Council, the architects, a lot of folks have been watching ways to avoid some of the mistakes that have been made early on. Housing continues to be an issue. I've seen low-income housing with solar panels on the roof. There are places in the country doing it with gardens in the back, with vines growing up. We can absolutely walk and chew gum at the same time.
Thank you. Greg, 1 minute. Any last thoughts on smooth surfaces?
Well,
Surfaces
one
and
of the
green surfaces?
impacts of adopting cooler surfaces and smart surfaces, you're bringing down energy bills, which are a very large part of the disposable income of people who are less well off. And you're improving air quality and decreasing flooding and risk, and those have real costs. So smart surface is a way to reduce the cost burden of living in a place, and to allow you to take advantage of the outdoors and to be outdoors in a way that is, as Cirilli says, and the American Public Health Association is an extraordinary partner in this, in making this very clear that when you make the outdoors cooler and less polluted, it has huge secondary consequences, not just in terms of health, but quality of life, the strength of the community, what Jane Jacobs calls eyes on the street, so kids can be out with other people on their stoops and they're out talking. When you create a neighborhood like that, or go back to a neighborhood like that, you've got a very vibrant community, and one where people want to stay, and where the health outcomes, the educational outcomes are much improved. And we've spent 2 centuries as a country mistreating low-income areas and making them miserable and hot and polluted. It's time to change that, and we now know how to do it. The infrastructure gives us an opportunity to do that across the country. We should seize that.
Thank you. Well, I assume that you're all convinced. Thank you to our audience for joining us for this timely and productive conversation, I think. Thanks to all our panelists for taking the time to share your perspectives. I want to thank Kelsey Foran, Maria Castillo, and Jaina Baronen at the Atlantic Council events team for their work in organizing today's event. If you'd like to re-watch this panel or share the stream with a colleague. You can find a recording on the Atlantic Council website and our YouTube channel. So thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.